Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to Arundel House to this event. Very pleased to welcome you, but also very pleased to welcome our speaker today, Harlan Ullman, who I've known for many years, a very thought-provoking and influential commentator on a whole range of defense, security and strategic issues, as he's reminded me, a former naval person himself, who served both in the US and the Royal Navies on
2 happy years.
2 happy years with the Royal Navy, and his experience included time in Vietnam on swift boats, but also captaining a destroyer in the Gulf. He's currently chairman of the Killowen Group, which advises leaders in government and business at the highest level, and also of CNI Guard here in the UK, of which he is chairman. But as I say, I've known him as a very useful and helpful and provoking commentator. He has a well read and influential regular column of comments that's widely distributed, and he's contributed to many security and defense conferences and gatherings of a significant nature globally, but certainly here on both sides of the Atlantic. So we're very pleased to welcome him here to discuss the subject of strategy for the 21st century, essentially in the face of the multifaceted crises and challenges that a seemingly increasingly chaotic world is presenting to us. What needs to be done in terms of a step change in approach to strategy. So he'll talk for about probably 30 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions, all of it on the record. Thank you.
You'll be sorry.
I'll stop there, and
Nick, thank you.
Harlan, take it away.
It is a great pleasure. Thank John Chipman. I have been long associated with a great institution way back when it was known as the Institute for Strategic Studies, which probably dates me. Actually, I'm going to be talking about a brains-based approach to strategic thinking. And your first response is, why would anybody not want to use brains? And I will get into that in a minute. But I have a higher duty, and I think the best way that I can explain this is to use some advice, wisdom given to me a long time ago by John Warner. Now, many of you will not know, but John Warner was the most distinguished senator from Virginia. He was chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He had served in the Navy and the Marine Corps in World War II and the Vietnam War, was Secretary of the Navy. But John was probably best known for being the 6th or 7th husband of Elizabeth Taylor, depending upon how you count Richard Burton. And John would make fun of himself and said on his wedding night, he knew what he had to do, but could he make it interesting? And so today I shall try to make my comments interesting. Why a brains-based approach to strategy? And I will answer the opposite, why not, in a minute. For a very, very long time, there were 3 questions that kept me awake at night. The first question was, why is it that every war America started, we lost? Second, why is it that, certainly for the last almost quarter century, every president that we have elected has not been ready in any way, shape, or prepared for high office, even though it's fair to say that Jack Kennedy made the observation that there's no school for presidents. But why were these particular people not prepared? And last, why is it that every time a bill came to a vote in the U.S. Congress, nobody had ever read it or understood it? And those 3 questions really caused my thinking and needed a good response. Now, this was taking place several years before the 100th anniversary of the First World War. And I thought that that anniversary might require another look. Now, you can ask, gee, there must have been a million different pieces, articles, books, journals, analyses written about World War I and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But I used the wisdom of General of the Army, later President Dwight Eisenhower, who said, when you have a tough problem, make it larger. And so with these three questions, I asked myself the further question, what do we not know, what did we not see from the assassination of the Archduke and his pregnant wife, Sophie, on the 28th of June, 1914? What has been missed? Is there anything that has been missed? And after giving this careful thought and realizing, obviously, World War I emerged, and from World War I came the seeds for World War II and the Cold War, everything seemed to be pretty settled. But then when you take a look at the fundamental forces that were reshaping the world, the first is well known, is the diffusion of power. That is to say, power has been spreading globally in many, 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 many ways. Second, interdependence. Events are related. Chinese stock market has a hiccup and the Dow drops 2,000 points. And thirdly, in this interconnected world, the information IT revolution has really joined people together. I'm told there may be as many cell phones today as there are human beings, so there are 6 billion cell phones. So all of these things have had some dramatic effects that have really not been recognized. Now, interestingly, some of the symptoms that emerged from this, which led to the erosion of the Westphalian state system, that is to say, states had always been the geopolitical center of gravity. But this diffusion of power empowered individuals and non-state groups. Osama bin Laden, Bradley Chelsea Manning, Al-Qaeda, EU, all these other groups, and of course the Islamic State. So here you had these factors, and these factors produced a couple of interesting symptoms. First, as the United States and its allies discovered in Afghanistan and Iraq, the best armies, navies, air forces, and marine corps in the world could not defeat an enemy who didn't have them. Think about that. Did not have them. Second, in terms of cost exchange ratios, how much money do you think all the improvised explosive devices that were made by the Taliban, by the jihadists in Iraq, wherever, cost? A couple of $1 million? $50 million? How much money do you think the United States spent in its counter-IED programs? $70 billion. B. So in terms of the cost exchange ratio, we were losing by several thousand to one. In other words, inadvertently perhaps, but the jihadis are spending us into oblivion. And so these things are important, but more important that grew out of all this, what I call 4 new horsemen of the apocalypse, which I argue are the greatest dangers to the world today. The first is failed and failing government. I will not comment on British governments. I'm a guest here. Just take a look at the United States. U.S. Congress can't even select a Speaker of the House of Representatives. Our government is in gridlock. We can't pass a budget. We seem to be wrong-footed by Vladimir Putin and everybody else. You take a look at the presidential campaign, and you don't know whether it's a reality show or a bad joke. Broken. But not just in America. What's the problem in Iraq? What's the problem in Afghanistan? What's the problem in Libya? What's the problem in most countries? Broken government. That, to me, is the number one danger that faces mankind. Second is economic despair, disparity, and dislocation. People cannot live on $2, $4, $10 a day, especially in an interconnected world. Now, poverty is not the root of all problems, but it certainly is a contributor. Think about that poor Tunisian fruit vendor who couldn't survive on what he was doing, and in protest set himself afire, and the Arab Spring broke out. This is economic dislocation. And unless or until this can be addressed, and in the United States, for example, you see a diminution of the middle class, stagnant wages. We have tremendous economic problems in the richest country in the world. Thirdly, religious violent extremism in the form of radical Islam. And you read the headlines, you know about the Islamic State, you know about Al-Qaeda. This is spreading. This is serious. It's not an existential threat to us in the West, but it's a huge threat to people in the region. And quite frankly, we have not been able to comprehend nor understand it, and therefore respond accordingly. And the fourth and final horseman is environmental catastrophe. In the United States, the West Coast is reeling in droughts and forest fires, and the East Coast is drowning in floods. Look at what happened with earthquakes in Japan and China. We're staying in Suffolk this weekend, the worst summer in Suffolk's history, and it's supposed to be the worst winter, whether that happens or not. But environmental catastrophe, including climate change or global warming, depending upon your perspective, could have the greatest effects. So here you have these four horsemen. And in my latest book called A Handful of Bullets, How the Murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand Still Menaces the Peace, the last third goes into corralling each of these four horsemen. I will not go into great detail, but would be happy to respond to your questions about what I do propose, because I want to focus back on a brains-based approach to strategic thinking. Because in my mind, where we are most lacking today is intellectually. We're not using our imaginations. We're not using the gray matter between our ears, which the great golfer Bobby Jones said, where all games are played. And so how can we think our way through these particular issues? Now, the reason that we don't always exercise our brains is not because we're dumb or stupid, but in the case of the United States, culture, crusade, and partisanship make it almost impossible. In terms of culture, we still don't understand the rest of the world. When I went to Vietnam about 140 years ago, we didn't have a clue. Yet when we went into Afghanistan, we didn't have a clue, and we certainly didn't have a clue in Iraq. So our inability to understand, which is cultural, is part and part, I'm afraid, of our DNA. Great issue here. Second part is crusade. America has always been an idealist country. You've all heard, I think, this frightful term, American exceptionalism. I wish I could ban that from the lexicon. It's an embarrassment to me. But why did we go into Vietnam? Jack Kennedy. We will pay any price, bear any burden. And we did. 58,000 Americans killed. God knows how many South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese and Southeast Asians were killed. But we followed up on that. What happened in 2003? Why did George W. Bush decide that he was going to go into Iraq? Weapons of mass destruction was the excuse. And if the Iraqis did not have weapons of mass destruction, which they didn't, the Bush administration would have said, but they might. Why did we go in? Because George W. Bush felt he was going to change, quote, the geostrategic landscape of the Middle East. And boy, did he. But not for the right reason. And partisanship. American politics, like most politics, has always been a contact sport. But the partisanship since Vietnam, the last 40 years, has gotten increasingly worse. And I'm so cynical that I believe that had the Republicans put in place this agreement with Iran called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Democrats would have been as hostile to it as the Republicans were because of the nature of partisanship. If you're not with us, you're against us. When the majority leader of the U.S. Senate could say my number one priority in 2009 is making Mr. Obama a one-term president, and when Mr. Obama can repeat the favor by dismissing Congress, we have a real problem. Now, those are some of the reasons why a brains-based approach just does not work. The bureaucracy doesn't make it work. You have sound bites. Obama comes in, Iraq is the bad war, Afghanistan is the good war, we're going to get out of both. And we did. Now, I appreciate that the Status of Forces agreement that Mr. Bush signed made it very difficult to extend our stay in Iraq, but it was absolutely predictable what was going to happen. I have been on the advisory board of the Supreme Allied Command of Europe, I like to think since Eisenhower, but not quite that long. And so when we went into Afghanistan, I was there not with the first wave, but very quickly. It was absolutely predictable what was going to happen in Afghanistan in 2002, 2003, 2004. And it's absolutely predictable. Ashraf Ghani is a good friend of mine. I think Ashraf is a great man, but we lost the opportunity to do something. And unfortunately, a lot of this was because of sound bites and promises, which then become policy, and that doesn't work. The strategic pivot to Asia, incredibly stupid in my mind. First of all, the way that it was done, the way that it was announced, because we infuriated the Chinese and scared all of our allies. What we should have said is we have to rebalance, because where are we focused right now? I mean, we talk about the Chinese building these forts at sea and so forth, but where's our focus? It's in the Persian Gulf and Middle East. Now, brains-based approach to strategy. 3 parts, and I will give solutions to how we get the 3 parts underway. First, it has to be based on knowledge and understanding of the situation in great depth. If you are an investment banker and you want to do an acquisition, you're going to know that company better than anybody else. You're going to go diving into that to know every single detail. We don't do that. We get engaged in Afghanistan. Before September 11th, 2001, most Americans could not spell Sunni or Shia. So knowledge and understanding are critical. Second, we have to understand, and here's the mindset we need. Our mindset is still very much, in my mind, focused firmly in the 20th century, which was a binary century. World War I, allies against the Central Powers. World War II, allies against the Axis power. Cold War, allies against the Soviets and the Communist bloc. Am I making a point here? It was binary. Today, the world is anything but binary. It is incredibly interconnected and interrelated. This is the 21st century. Think about what's happening in Syria. You've got Russia, you've got Iraq, you've got Turkey, you've got NATO, you've got Iran, and the list goes on. In some areas, we have very common interest. We want to get rid of the Islamic State. Quote, we want to disrupt and destroy it. Iran wants to do that because Iran sees the Islamic State as an existential threat. I think Mr. Putin is more ambivalent. If he could help destroy it, fine. But the point is, on the one hand, we have common interest. On the other hand, we don't have common interest. Look what's happening in Ukraine. We're still worried about some of the things that the Grand Ayatollah talks about in Iran, about Israel, and about America, and so forth. But you have to understand that these issues are all interrelated. It requires subtlety and sophistication. And when you have a National Security Council staff in the White House that may have upwards of 600 or 700 or 800 people, in which there's really no authority or accountability or lines of responsibility, I'll ask a question of you. Please draw me a line item diagram of who in America is responsible for taking on the Islamic State. And when you finish that piece of homework in about 20 years, you can turn that into me, because I don't think there is a line diagram. But my point is, how do you exercise subtlety and sophistication when you have a bureaucracy that large? When Kissinger and Brzezinski were national security advisors, it was a binary world, the national security staff of principals was no more than 40, because they coordinated. And I would argue with a staff of 600 or 700, it becomes impossible, because who is in charge? And finally, you have to base your thinking on outcomes. What is it you wish to achieve? We don't do that. When we went into Iraq, it was entirely tactical. Defeat the Iraqi army, which was no big deal. Get rid of Saddam Hussein, and then get out. And General Tommy Franks, the only U.S. general in my mind who lost 2 wars in our history, said, I want you to take the same risks of getting out as you did going in. This was tactical. What was the outcome we wanted? What we wanted was a reasonably safe, secure, more or less pluralistic state. Why did we not do that? So you have to start with outcomes, but we are not comfortable doing that. First, then, with understanding and knowledge, how do you achieve that? I think we need to recreate today the 21st century equivalent of Bletchley Park. As you all know, because you saw that movie, Imitation Game, with Benedict Cumberbatch playing Alan Turing, all the codes, I shouldn't say all the codes, but the German codes, a number of them in Enigma were broken at Bletchley Park. We need to expand that by orders of magnitude. We have, in terms of social media, an infinite amount of information and data, some of which is very valuable. I'm also a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council, which is equivalent in America to the IISS here, to the degree that anything is equivalent to IISS. And we had 3 youngsters in their early 20s who, by using social media, Google Earth, all the other kinds of things, were able to trace a Russian paratrooper from Siberia all the way to Ukraine. Photographic evidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on all the social media, Facebook, on and on and on and on. Why can't we do that today much more broadly in understanding and obtaining knowledge about the other side? When the president gets his morning, American president gets his morning intelligence brief, probably 2/3 is open source. So why are we not doing more? Now, the difference between Bletchley Park, obviously, and then using the internet is that you are vulnerable. Unless you have certain systems, people know that you're getting into the internet. Homegrown terrorists may make you a target, or there may be more subtle ways. That is to say, the bad guys will get into your own computer, jam you. General Breedlove, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, found that his Facebook page had been hacked by the Russians in, I guess, exposing their great sense of humor. So we need to have the equivalent of Bletchley Park that uses open source material that's available right now to get far better understanding. And we don't do it. We spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on overhead surveillance system, the most sophisticated stuff in the world, and yet we're surprised when Putin does what he does in Syria. It was self-evident, but we didn't know that. We didn't know that. So that's how you deal with understanding and knowledge. It is far more difficult, however, to change the mindset to the 21st century. Now, one way to do that, it seems to me, is by far greater education and training. If you take a look at our graduate schools in America, most of them are still based on a 20th century way of thinking. In fact, most of the professors who teach IR, political science, were probably trained in the 70s, some in the late 60s, some in the 80s. The world has changed. It's entirely different. Needs new skill sets. That's going to be very difficult. It's also going to be very difficult to be able to educate politicians because you're so busy running for office, you have very little time to do anything else. And quite frankly, politics in the United States today is about being elected and re-elected and doing the worst you can to damage your opposition rather than governing. This has been a profound shift in American politics and not for the better. So we need education. And last, the only way that you are going to be able to get outcomes as the way of focusing thinking is to put in place, in essence, the equivalent. Kings and queens used to have a court jester. And smart CEOs have a no man or a no woman who says you can't do that. The only way we're going to do it is to put in place a permanent red team that dissects any policy by first looking at the assumptions and challenging them. If you go back, and you won't, to 2009 when the Obama administration did its Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy, there were 9 assumptions that it made. All were wrong, every one of them, but nobody challenged the assumptions. That is what we have to do if we're going to be able to compete in the future. Now, having said that, you will hear stories that today is the most dangerous time in our lifetime, the most complicated, the most complex world we've ever seen. That's absolute nonsense. Go back to 1945, 46, 47, 48, 49. Forget about World War I and World War II and the run-up. What happens in 45? Churchill, who wins the war, is voted out of office. We now are trying to take over and occupy Germany and Japan. We don't have a clue what's happening. Russia is moving west. So now we have 1946. And what happens? Russia is moving west. 47, coldest winter in history, the Berlin blockade. India, Pakistan separate, 1 million people are killed. 48, creation of Israel, war. 49, NATO, terrific. But 49, Stalin is going to get the bomb. We have to preempt. We can never allow Stalin, the maniac, and the Soviet Union have the bomb. It'll be the end of mankind. Oh, and by the way, Mao takes over China. Now tell me that that world was less complicated, less dangerous, and less complex than it is today. Nonsense. But we have become victims. We don't want to exercise our brains to think our way through. Now, I said earlier, I don't believe that the dangers are existential. I think they're serious. I don't see barbarians at the gate. Yes, I think the Islamic State is existential in the region, but we have plenty of opportunities if we are clever enough to exercise them, which we don't always do. I would argue that in the future, at least as far as I can see, the problems are that in the West, in Britain, the United States, and other countries, unless we take advantage, our standards of living are going to decline. The middle class is going to be squeezed and squeezed badly. Now, if you're worth 100 million pounds or something, then obviously you're not going to be all that affected. But standards of living are going to decline, and certainly in the United States, expectations about the American dream will be greatly diminished. Maybe sometime in the future, that will make a difference. After all, remember, probably the most trenchant line in the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson is in the second paragraph. When government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and establish a new government. I'm not suggesting revolution in America tomorrow, but I am suggesting at some stage it could be a problem. Having said that, if we are prepared to adopt a brains-based approach to strategic thinking, to use our minds, as Churchill said, because we don't have enough money, now we have to think our way through, then I think that there are solutions that can be made. But we have to be courageous, we have to be innovative, we have to use initiative, and we cannot be constrained by the notion that things are too tough, the problems are too difficult. That is nonsense. And with that, I'd be delighted to answer all of your questions. Thank you.
Harlan, thank you very much for that. I suggested at the beginning that you were both thoughtful and provocative. I think that's a most provocative set of ideas that you put out there to chew on. So yes, let's open it up to questions. I realised also at the beginning that I was very remiss in the sense that I didn't identify myself, partly because I'm the least important person in the room, but I'm Nick Childs. I'm the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security here at the Institute. I say that only because as we go into questions, I would ask you, for the courtesy of everyone else, and particularly the speaker, you identify yourself before you pose a question. Let's go straight over here.
Hello, I'm Phil Ayer, former retired naval officer. Bletchley Park, World War II. The entire British chess team was brought in. They're part of it, demonstrating thinking. Now, strategy then is maybe different from strategy now, but consider deep knowledge, and consider thinking things through, consider the track record that Gary Kasparov has right now in thinking through the strategy proposals for Russia. I'd be interested in your thoughts on what he says about confrontation. Secondly, a suggestion, what do you think about the way to ban American exceptionalism from the lexicon could be to embrace it from its context when America was thinking of itself as unique in its democracy in the rest of the world, but change it to today when democracy has spread, so the exceptional part has moved from America to democracy. Democracy from exceptionalism. What do you think of that?
Democracy kills, to quote the title of a book written by a former BBC colleague of yours, Humphrey Hawksley. I'm very uncomfortable with spreading democracy because it doesn't always work. Iraq. And I'm also uncomfortable with exceptionalism. It's part of our DNA, and I just think it shows a certain arrogance and a hubris, which I think is just no longer works, especially in today's interconnected world. And quite frankly, most people looking at the United States from outside today, while they're impressed by its wealth and its economy and its businesses, in many ways, people are not taking us all that seriously because of some of the stupid things that we're doing. Just look at what's happening in the House of Representatives right now. About Russia. Teddy Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." We speak loudly, we're all bark and no bite. Ash Carter, Secretary of Defense, I have the greatest admiration for Ash, but I wish he wouldn't feed the Russians with one-liners when he said this is gasoline. The Russians love that. We need to understand what Putin is up to, and we don't want to. We think he's recreating the Soviet Empire. We think all these things. We don't understand his basic weaknesses. So what is the outcome we want with Russia? We'd like Russia to be part of the West. We'd like to see Russia viable. We'd like to see it not being as difficult. The reason I believe that Putin is in Syria is because he needs to extricate himself from Ukraine. But more importantly, he no longer trusts the Americans to be able to do anything positively. He takes a look at what happened in Iraq. And remember, he argued strenuously with Bush not to go in. He takes a look at what happened in Libya, the fall of Gaddafi, what happened in Egypt with the fall of Mubarak, the Muslim Brotherhood, and he sees what's happening in Syria to be critical. I don't think he really cares about Assad. I think he's a very cynical person in this regard. And so I think his view is, and by the way, his military deployment is tiny. He's got a couple of thousand troops, maybe 30 or 40 airplanes. As of yesterday, they only flew 60 or 70 missions, maybe a few more. So this is not a big deployment. And having those missiles fired from those tiny little ships in the Caspian was a brilliant move. Because everybody in NATO is saying, oh my God, the Russians fired cruise missiles that went almost 1,000 miles. The fact is that most of them missed or didn't do much damage wasn't the point. This was great theater. And then they had a magnificent press conference in Moscow with the Minister of Defense and Putin, touting all their wares. We, unfortunately, the President has never really confronted Putin, which he should have done a long time ago, and say, what are your objectives? First of all, I would say, speak very softly and not say a great deal. Second, we have to realize that there's a fundamental tension between Iran and Russia over the Islamic State. Iran sees the Islamic State as existential. Russia does not. So we need to work that. We need to use the joint cooperative plan of action with Iran to work Iran more to be supportive of us. We need to bypass the Baghdad government and provide better arms to the Kurds and have the Kurds move against Raqqa. And I hope one day a Russian airplane does fly deeply into Turkey, because I would shoot it down and make a signal that way. That's probably not going to happen because we don't want to be confrontational. And the most important thing I would do would be secretly to send a very senior American to Russia. I would argue for the Secretary of State or somebody of that caliber, to have a real heart-to-heart talk with Putin that Mr. Obama was not able to have in Washington, in New York City at the UN General Assembly, simply because he and Putin do not get along, and it's a very, very tough. And say, all right, how are we going to mutually work ourselves out of this? I think the notion of confrontation, I think of trying to delegitimize the Russians is not going to work. It's going to play into their hands. And if Putin is smart enough, and he may be too arrogant and may make mistakes, but my guess is he's probably going to be engaged in Syria for 3 or 4 months, some short time, until Assad is strong enough to do whatever he can do, then hopes that Assad will be able to put down the civil war, Putin withdraws, and like Mr. Obama, maybe he'll get a Nobel Peace Prize too.
Gentleman in the front row here.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. My question is about pivot Asia.
Yeah.
So from Asian perspective, this strategy is necessary because China has a great power to insist their interest
right.
beyond the international rule. And from European perspective, it is necessary for United States to pivot on Middle East. But from U.S. perspective, they have shale gas and not necessary to have oil in Middle East. And so ASEAN is U.S. interest. Why do you think it is not necessary for the United States to shrink pivot Asia so much?
I don't think the administration really has a good understanding and knowledge of China, quite frankly. I think that this is more a soundbite because of the economy and because of China's growth. And as I said, I think that the way that the strategic pivot was announced was not very smart and not very effective. For those of you who have traveled to China, it's an amazing country. China has an underclass of perhaps 300 or 400 million. Everybody has a cell phone. Wherever you go in distant China, there's always a dish Chinese can see. You probably don't know this, but in China there are reports of more than 100,000 riots of more than 20,000 people a year. Every Chinese emperor, chairman, leader has been afraid of a peasant revolution. Everyone. The role of the PLA, People's Liberation Army, is what? To keep stability. What does that mean? No riots, no revolutions. So China has this huge underclass. It also is very, very corrupt. It has to shift from an industrial to a service economy, which is very difficult. And it also has very qualified leaders. Now, some are not, but if you go back 5,000 years, if you were living in the provinces in Xinjiang or wherever, you passed the exams, you went to Peiping, Beijing, wherever, because it was always a meritocracy. Take the Chinese ambassador here to London. He's a fabulously able guy. He was the DCM in New York, in Washington. He was a graduate like myself with the Fletcher School. He and his wife looked like come off the cover of Esquire magazine. He was the ambassador to Egypt, and he was deputy governor of one of the big provinces in China. Unbelievably qualified. So China has all this. Yes, they're trying to increase their military, but it's going to be a long haul. They have a 40-year-old aircraft carrier that used to be a cruise liner. Yes, they're making progress. But the point is we have overreacted. It seems to me that we have plenty of allies in Asia that can balance China if we want. Japan, Abe has become slightly more aggressive in terms of Japan's posture. You've got South Korea. You have Southeast Asia. Remember the last time China went into Vietnam in the late 70s? They got bloodied badly. So we have lots of allies around China. We also have to realize that China understands its weaknesses. So my biggest concern is that we overreact. We view China as a military threat. China it has proven to be less aggressive in terms of territorial outreach. In many ways, they're like the Brits in a mercantile power in the 1800s, because wherever they go in Africa, what is the first thing they do? They build either a mosque or a football field, and they're very good that way. So I think that we've exaggerated the dangers of China. We have underplayed China's weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and as a result, we've tried to put this on more of a military-to-military relationship, and I think that's a huge mistake. And then, by the way, we said we're going to transfer 60% of the Navy to the Pacific. Guess what? That 60% will be far fewer ships than we have right now because the Navy's shrinking. So I think everything we have done, unfortunately, was the wrong message for the wrong reasons. We'll see what the next president does. But I think there's a certain restraint. That means China is not going to be able to do all the things that they want to do. And by the way, if the real estate market crashes, if their stock market crashes again, we're going to have an international meltdown. I think that's much more of a serious threat than Chinese military capability right now.
If I could just interject for a moment, in terms of this understanding thing, is your argument that the understanding doesn't exist, or is it just that there isn't a mechanism, or there's a willful refusal to leverage it? I think in terms of, for example,
all the above, Nick. I mean, look, we have some smart people, but once you get into the White House, the political system makes it very difficult to be smart. You have these endless National Security Council meetings with principals in which nothing gets decided. And when you do have an expert, that expert is usually so low in the pecking order that it's difficult for that expert to be heard. During the Bush administration, I don't know any serious outside observer who didn't say, the war is not the issue, what next? But the administration was deaf. And if you would like to get a better view, this is off the record. A better assessment of the strategic thinking in the White House. Ask the former National Security Jim Jones his view, and you will get more than an earful than you'll get from me.
Okay. Gentleman in the second row here.
IISS member Vipul Thakur. I got two comments, sir. One, fails to understand why the two main parties in the USA cannot have a basic common program so it doesn't affect the budget running of government and core national interests. Number two, I think the US and the West, they are behind the curve of reality. When it comes to global Islamic terrorism, we keep on blaming Iran. But whatever mischief Iran plays, is very limited in scope and is limited to Middle East in their sectarian war. The global Islamic terrorism is Sunni. The ideology is from Saudi Arabia, money is from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and because of geopolitics of oil, we ignore it. Unless we wake up, smell coffee, and say, it's the Sunnis, terrorism will never end. And the West, as you mentioned, sir, will keep on spending billions and billions of dollars for no return.
You're absolutely right about the latter. But because of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, we continue to call Iran the largest state sponsor of terrorism. It's nonsense. It's just not real. But if you say that in America, you'll be accused of being a traitor or being soft or whatever. We can't. We don't want to admit that Sunni terrorism is a far, far greater problem than Shia-led terrorism. You're absolutely right. Now, possibly this agreement on nuclear weapons with Iran can change that. But unfortunately, history counts. The Shah was a villain. I actually met the Shah. I've been in Tehran with the Shah. The Shah was a villain. So 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini took over, all of a sudden America was, our guy had been rejected. And then the embassy was taken over and there were hostages for 444 days. We got over Vietnam. John McCain and John Kerry, who served in Vietnam, McCain, who was a prisoner of war for 6 years, in essence forgave the North Vietnamese for killing 58,000 Americans. We have not yet forgiven Iran for holding our hostages for 444 days. Now about both political parties. When guns, gays, God, and gestation periods become critical political issues, you know you have a problem. And one side says this, the other side says this. And there's no meeting in between. How many people have been killed in America since September 11th by terrorists, even if you include Major Hassan at Fort Hood? Less than 30. Since September 11th, how many Americans have been killed by guns?
Thousands.
Almost 500,000. We're worried about domestic terror, and we're not worried about guns. I mean, there's an irrationality here, unfortunately. And the parties are just take a look at the candidates and running and go to read their websites if you want to be frightened. And so, unfortunately, we're not as rational as we'd like to be. Both parties are being governed by the far left and the far right. Look at Bernie Sanders. He's a socialist. His economic policies would destroy the United States. Yet he's running neck and neck with Hillary Clinton. And I know some of you in the audience have a great admiration for Donald Trump. I'm not sure what kind of a president he would make. But our system is really quite strange. We say we're exceptional. I say it's broken.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman at the end.
Michael Arthur, former British diplomat, now working for both. You said a lot about new ways of strategic analysis for the 21st century, and you haven't said much about the use of force in the 21st century. And meanwhile, governments from China through Russia to the United States and elsewhere in Europe are modernizing their weaponry and their delivery systems in a slightly conventional way, next generation of that. Could you just say how you think force will be used in the next couple of generations?
Yeah, thank you for that. First of all, there's going to be structural disarmament in the United States because of inbuilt cost growth. The greatest problem facing the U.S. military today is not the Islamic State, it's not Russia, it's not China, it's internal cost growth, which is running between 5 and 7% a year. It's for people, it's for precision munitions, it's for pencils. We're going to be spending close to $700 billion a year for our military. We have 1 million fewer people than we did during the height of the Reagan buildup, and yet we're spending $100 billion a year more in constant dollars then. The same thing is happening. NATO has said we're going to have 2%. Look what's happening here in Britain. You're going to afford 2 carriers, you're going to afford Trident. The Army is getting squeezed. You're dependent upon the reserve. And the Exchequer is going to say, I just can't come up with it. That's the problem. Now, I just got back from Estonia, where I have been arguing. The former Secretary General of NATO called for smart defense. And of course the counter-argument is who wants stupid defense? NATO has an annual meeting, a summit meeting of heads of state in Warsaw this summer. My view has been we have to change NATO's strategy in the Balkans and in the Black Sea. So it's more like a porcupine or hedgehog defense. Boeing isn't going to like this, but I think you have to give them Stingers, air weapons, javelin anti-armor weapons, sea mines, so forth, so that if Russia wants to impose itself, it's going to be badly bloodied. We have to beef up cyber, and we have to beef up counter-propaganda. And we have to do a far better analysis of what the Russians are doing. The Russian military has a couple of strong points. It's got several thousand Theater nuclear weapons, where we have a handful. Big advantage. They've got good Spetsnaz. Their special forces are pretty good. They have got great propaganda. I mean, when Putin leaves there, he ought to go to Hollywood. He'll replace Steven Spielberg. And finally, they've got great cyber. All right? So what should NATO be doing? I argued with a certain country in the Black Sea not to buy 15 used F-16s from Portugal. But for a variety of bad reasons, they did. If NATO changes how it's working on the wings to this defensive type strategy, it will cost less money. We'll be able to afford it. And we'll be much better off. Now, in the future, I think you have to plan for the possibility of a big war that could be catalytic. I don't think that war would take more than, say, 200 or 300,000 Americans. It would not be with China. As Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, said, anybody who wants to engage in China needs to have his head examined. He's absolutely right. But a contingency in the Middle East, so forth. And we have to be prepared for non-conventional uses of military force, capacity building, all sorts of things in this world where military force should be the last resort. Too often we use it too soon. And we have to be more subtle and more clever in how we respond. Putin launches missiles from the Caspian. What is our response? He's got an escadra. In fact, it's very funny. The Moskva is so old that when I was in the Navy, in my destroyer, I remember trailing her in the North Atlantic someplace. I mean, and we just converted from, sail to steam. Why don't we send a submarine that makes itself known? There are ways that you can signal using military force that suggest these vulnerabilities. We're not very clever, because what happens is that, well, let me rephrase that. This will answer your question. David Richards, former Chief of Defense Staff's book, In Command, has a foreword by Max Hastings. I would read that, in which Max says, in part, that Richards occasionally provided adult leadership to the children in number 10. And the same thing applies in the White House. You have to be able to be more subtle. And when you've got 20 or 30-something-year-olds, it's very difficult. But there are ways that are using the military far more subtly with greater sophistication. And by the way, I think we're spending much too much money on the military. But given these internal costs, look at the United States. The Jerry Ford cost of the carrier, $13 billion. What's the F-35 going to cost? $1 gazillion. Trident replacement, on and on and on and on. We can't afford. And even we build one of the LCSs, landing whatever it's little combat ships. That's almost $1 billion for a ship that's going to have 50 sailors. And in my day, we could take that ship over in 37 seconds. So we have to look at things differently. Military force, you've got to be prepared along a bigger spectrum. You've got to have people who are better educated and trained. General Chuck Krulak, former Commandant of the Marine Corps, talked about the strategic corporal, young kid in the middle of nowhere who all of a sudden has this advanced. You've got to be able to prepare people. And Brigadier Tom Coppinger is in charge of the 1st ISR Brigade, which is trying to do that. And Brigadier Atkins is in charge of the 77th Brigade here. And I think the British are showing a great deal of innovation and imagination in how they're trying to modify their forces for the future. NATO needs to do that, and the U.S. needs to do that, in my mind.
Desmond Bowen.
Desmond Bowen, I'm a IIS member. I'd like to connect two thoughts that you presented to us. One about the focus on outcomes, which clearly is vital, but also an earlier thought about state failure, and actually to some extent political failure, or the failure of politics.
Governance.
And governance.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking less about ourselves at home, but thinking about governance overseas. And, arguably, despite many errors in Iraq, actually Maliki was himself, he sowed the seeds for further state failure in Iraq.
Of course.
How do you deal with politics? I mean, how do you get countries to put themselves in a position where they can govern, where they can control, without actually advocating authoritarianism?
In some cases, you don't go in. That's the problem. If we think we're going to go into a country like Iraq or Afghanistan and be able to impose a government, we're out of our minds. And nobody says that to start. That's a fact. It's not Japan or Germany in 1945, both of which had democratic roots, both of which were desperate, both of which we had complete control. We were the autocracy. MacArthur was a virtual dictator, similarly in Germany. Without that authority and without a country that's prepared to be able to respond, don't do it. It's almost that simple. Right now, the number one thing we should be doing in Iraq, it's probably too late, is revoke the de-Baathification laws. Sunni versus Shia is what was responsible for the Islamic State. We can't undo that. And so too often, before we go in, when we went into Afghanistan, we should have gone in to kill Osama bin Laden. He got away at Tora Bora, I would argue, because of the incompetence of General Franks. Whether that's true or not, we'll see. We then shifted for nation building. You can't do it. Unless we're going to invest trillions of dollars and be prepared to stay there as long as we stayed in Germany and Japan, and that was with a Marshall Plan, you've got to be very careful. And so I think the whole notion of regime change, unless you're prepared to stay 50 years and spend an infinite amount of money, in almost every case, is a non-starter. You can't fix it. We're stuck in Iraq, and I think you're going to see this. I think what's going to happen is you're going to see Iraq be divided probably three ways, maybe in a federalist state. At this stage, it's hard to tell. And it's hard to tell if the Islamic State will fall of its own weight, if we're clever and can help it, or if it increases. But right now, that's uncertain. And the only thing I can guarantee you is that unless somebody like an Assad rules with an iron hand, and he may not be able to do that, civil war is going to continue as it did in Lebanon for years and years and years, and you're going to see a cauldron. So my advice is, don't go in.
Gentleman in the second row.
There are 2 points which will lead to the question I'd like to raise. The 2 points are, if you look at the international alliance which is bombing Syria, ISIS, now, it is...
There is no international alliance.
Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, with some facilities, logistics from Turkey. And those people are the ones who have created ISIS.
No, I disagree with that. ISIS was created in Iraq by Maliki and the Shia persecution of Sunnis. End of statement.
There is no ideological or theological support or intellectual basis from those countries. There were supplies of arms,
No, look, you've got. It's a very complicated mess, as you know. You've got Sunni versus Shia splits. You've got Arab versus Iran, and Arab versus Turks. You've got Russia, and you've got the United States, and you've got the West. But where we have gone most wrong, we have a coalition of 60-odd countries that are part of the anti-Islamic State coalition. John Allen, a retired Marine general, has been the special envoy to this coalition. How much authority does John Allen have? Zero. There are 9 lines of action that the coalition is supposed to be pursuing, from money laundering to stop the flow of foreign fighters to boom, 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 boom. They're not participating because the United States has not exercised the leadership to do this. And so as a result, at this stage, whether it's a stalemate with the Islamic State or not, we are not winning. We are not winning.
The second point is the contradictory statements from the United States as to whether they will be able to eradicate ISIS today or leave or after 10 years. Now, this will create a great deal of confusion.
Of course.
So what is really the strategy of the United States and, as you said, objective-based strategy, and doesn't this constitute a good reason for Putin to step in?
Well, I could not agree with you more. Look, Jack Kennedy, some of the things that Jack Kennedy said were brilliant. Kennedy said the only thing worse than being an enemy of the United States was being a friend. Now, if you were an observer, who would you want to come to your aid for the long term? Putin or Obama? Think about that. As unsavory as Putin may be, here's his ally. Russians and the Soviets have been in Syria since 1971. Putin supports me. The Americans, I'm afraid, are not, as you know, in the region, are not as highly regarded as we once were. This is why the Saudis and other countries are so desperately afraid of the agreement with Iran, because they think we're gone. And all the words of support that the president has made, I don't think have resonated the way they could. There are a lot of other things we could have done. We could have guaranteed some sort of nuclear umbrella in the event that. We could move more to missile defense. We could even station a ballistic missile submarine somewhere in the region just to make a signal. So you have to show commitment. And quite frankly, and this is what distresses me most, when during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy said, "I'm sending photographic evidence of the Soviets in Cuba to de Gaulle." His special envoy arrived in Paris and said, "Mr. President," and de Gaulle said, "I have the word of the president. I do not need to see the photographs." Who would say that today? Big question. Big question.
We're drawing to a close. I think just the last question goes to the gentleman in the third row.
Jonathan Katzenberg, I'm a member of the Institute. You come across as very despairing of the politicians, but I think what you've said today has made great sense. But I find that sort of an easy sort of cynicism from civil servants and military people. It's the politicians who actually have to deal with these. Their jobs are on the line. They know how to do it. You run for elected office, you wouldn't get there. They know how to do it. They know how to negotiate. They've done it for a long time. And you had David Cameron's riposte to David Richards, which I think was very apt in saying, "You do the fighting, I'll do the talking." David Richards wasn't elected. He can't make those sort of big policy choices. He's not. That's out of his job scope. What is your response to that?
First of all, the people who we tend to elect, and it's happening in your country, do not have the requisite experience to serve as chief executive. And it shows. And they appoint people around them. Indeed, I'm very despairing of our politicians. If you go back and look at the Congress 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, you had great senators. You had Dick Lugar, you had Sam Nunn, you had Howard Baker, you had Bob Dole. They would not be allowed to join the Republican or Democratic Party today. That's how much they've shifted. Take a look at the Senate today or the House. How many great figures are there? And go back 20 or 30 or 40 years. What's happened is that politics, unfortunately, has descended for a lot of very bad reasons. And in my book, if you read it, I go into solutions for trying to fix these problems, such as universal voting, where everybody has got to go to the polls. When only 50 or 54% of Americans vote, when the parties are dominated by the left and right, and now you have the threat of being primary, that is to say, somebody will run against you in your own district because you're too far to the left, too far to the right. Why did John Boehner quit? Why did Representative McCarthy stand down as being the Speaker of the House? Because of this group of 50. And so you have politics today, which has become very vindictive. As I said, it's driven more by guns, gays, God, and gestation periods than it is about really substantive issues. That there has been a despair with government that began during the Vietnam years, but has multiplied. Why do you think Donald Trump and Ben Carson and Bernie Sanders are doing so well? Because the Americans have had enough with their government. And these are the only candidates who can expose a difference. And by the way, do the best brains go into government today? And the answer is there are a lot of reasons in America why not. If you go into government, you put your life on the line. The number of forms that you have to fill is about that big. If you have any money, it's going to cost you a fortune to divest yourself. And all this is public record. And then you get subject to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, because somebody in the Senate may decide they don't like you or they don't like something the president is doing, and they hang you up. So people who want to go into government do so in many reasons because they do go in to do good and they end up doing well. And you have these rotating belts that you come to a think tank or something else waiting for the next people, so you bring in the old ideas. And yes, I'm very, very cynical about American politics today. And the problem is that one of the problems is, in my judgment, the American public has not engaged itself sufficiently in terms of who it elects president. It's become terribly passive. And unless or until that changes, we're going to get the government we deserve. And quite frankly, that government will remain broken. And as I said, there will be a diminution in our standards of living and in the expectations of the future for most Americans. And we become just like the rest of the world. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's an objective reality. We can fix it. There are opportunities to do so. Whether we do or we don't remains to be seen. And I disagree with David Cameron. He ought to listen, and maybe sometimes he ought to let some of the generals do the talking. Because Richards was saying, do not go into Libya. Do not go into Libya. This is a mistake. And sadly, he was proven right.
Harlan, thank you for, as I expected you would, providing us with a stimulating hour.
My pleasure.
Hour of discussion. But we must draw it to a close now.
Thank you very much.
I would say we should show our appreciation for it in the time-honoured manner. And thank you.